What would you do if your only way to survive was to marry a stranger? Elena Carter had no choice. Her family was drowning in debt, and billionaire Alexander Sterling offered salvation. But this was never just a marriage. It was a game of power, secrets, and betrayal. When she uncovered the truth, she faced an impossible decision: escape or embrace the darkness. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling stories. Elena Carter tightened the straps of her faded backpack as she hurried down the cracked sidewalk, her breath visible in the cold morning air. The city around her was alive with noise. Car horns blaring, people shouting over the hum of traffic, the scent of gasoline and cheap street food mixing into a familiar, suffocating haze. She pulled her worn coat tighter around her thin frame, trying to ward off the chill creeping into her bones. She was late again. The bus stop was just ahead, and she broke into a half-jog, dodging a group of construction workers unloading equipment onto the curb. The last thing she needed was to miss her bus and be late for class. Medical school was already consuming every second of her life, and her professors weren't exactly forgiving of excuses. Not that they'd understand hers. She barely made it, sliding into a seat near the window just as the doors hissed shut. The ride was routine, almost muscle memory by now. The same faces, the same tired expressions of overworked people struggling to keep up with life. Elena understood them too well. At 22, she carried more weight on her shoulders than most people did in a lifetime. Her mother's illness had stolen what little security they had left. Joanne Carter had once been a vibrant woman, full of laughter and warmth. Now she was a shell of that person, her body weakened by the relentless grip of chronic illness. The medications alone cost more than Elena made in 2 months, and they were barely keeping her stable. Then there was Michael. At 14, her little brother was already slipping down a dangerous path. He was constantly getting into fights at school, running with the wrong crowd, testing boundaries Elena didn't have the time to enforce. He needed guidance, discipline, things she wanted to give him but couldn't when she was drowning in work and studies. And Lily, her baby sister, only 6 years old. She was still young enough to believe in fairy tales, but Elena could see the cracks forming, the way she clung to her stuffed rabbit at night, the way she hesitated before asking for things she knew they couldn't afford. The thought of them filled her with a heavy, suffocating kind of love. Rent was due. 2 weeks, the landlord had said, his voice sharp with impatience. 2 weeks, or they were out. He didn't care about her mother's health, or the fact that she was juggling 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. The world never cared. Elena exhaled slowly, staring at the city blurring past the bus window. She was running out of options. By the time she got home that evening, exhaustion dragged at every part of her. She dropped her bag by the door and made her way to the tiny kitchen, where her mother sat at the table, hands curled around a cup of tea. The steam rose in delicate wisps, but her mother's face was pale, drawn with fatigue. "Elena, sit," Joanne said softly, glancing toward the small living room where Michael and Lily were watching TV. That tone, that careful, deliberate softness. Elena's stomach twisted. She sank into the chair across from her mother, bracing herself. "The landlord came by again today." The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of an avalanche. Elena's fingers curled into her lap. "I'll figure something out," she said automatically, her voice steadier than she felt. Her mother shook her head. "You're already doing too much. You can't keep this up." The frustration swelled in her chest, sharp and bitter. But before she could argue, a knock sounded at the door. Her brow furrowed. They weren't expecting anyone. She stood, moving cautiously to answer it. Her uncle stood on the other side. Derek Carter was a broad, imposing man in his 50s, always smelling of motor oil and coffee. A truck driver by trade, but Alina had always suspected he had other ways of making money, ways he never talked about. "Uncle Derek?" she said, stepping aside to let him in. "What are you doing here?" His gaze swept over the tiny apartment, taking in the peeling wallpaper, the patched-up furniture, the quiet desperation woven into every inch of the place. "I came to talk," he said, his tone unreadable. "It's important." They moved to the living room, her mother watching warily from the kitchen. Derek leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, fingers laced together. "I know things are hard for you," he started, "and I've been thinking about how I can help." Elena's heart pounded. "I got a proposition." The way he said it made her uneasy. "There's a man I used to work for," Derek continued. "Rich. Real rich. Lives in a big house on the other side of town." He paused, gauging her reaction. "He's looking for a wife." Silence. Elena stared at him, her mind blank. "A wife?" she echoed, disbelief curling in her voice. Derek nodded. "He's old. 64, I think. Got some kind of illness, so he ain't got much time left. But he's willing to pay." "A lot?" Her breath caught. "Not looking for love, nothing like that," Derek clarified. "Just a legal arrangement. You'd be taken care of. Your mom, the kids, everything would be covered. And when he goes, you get the inheritance." The words should have disgusted her. And they did. But beneath the revulsion was something else. A terrible, creeping temptation. She thought about the eviction notice, the bills stacked on the counter, the way her mother's hands trembled from pain when she thought no one was looking. She thought about Michael, angry and lost, one wrong decision away from wrecking his future. She thought about Lily, who still believed in magic, still smiled like the world wasn't falling apart. Alina swallowed hard. "You can't be serious." "I am," Derek said simply. "I know it ain't what you wanted for yourself, but life don't care about that, does it?" She hated that he was right. After he left, she sat in silence, head in her hands. Her entire life, she had dreamed of a future she controlled, a future where she built something for herself, where she made her family proud by standing on her own 2 feet. But dreams were a luxury she could no longer afford. She had to choose, pride or survival. By the time she went to bed that night, the choice had already been made. She would meet him, the man who would change everything. Elena stood outside the towering iron gates, her fingers tightening around the strap of her worn-out bag. The mansion loomed before her, an intimidating fortress of stone and glass, its sharp edges cutting into the overcast sky. The place didn't belong in the city. It looked like something out of an old Gothic novel, the kind where secrets lurked behind every heavy wooden door. Cold wind whipped through the air, carrying the scent of damp earth and something faintly metallic. Even the trees surrounding the estate stood unnaturally still, as if they too were watching her. Uncle Derek had dropped her off 20 minutes ago, muttering something about how this was her decision now before driving off, leaving her alone with her doubts. The weight of what she was about to do settled heavily in her chest. She could still turn around. She could still walk away. But then she thought of home. Her mother's failing health, the eviction notice, Michael's anger. Lily's quiet sadness. This wasn't about her. It had never been about her. The gates creaked open with a slow, mechanical groan, and a uniformed man stepped out of the guardhouse. He was tall and stiff, his expression unreadable as he gestured for her to follow the cobblestone path leading to the house. She swallowed hard and forced her feet to move, every step feeling like she was sinking deeper into something she couldn't escape. The mansion was even more imposing up close. Massive stone columns framed the entrance, and the front doors were made of dark wood, carved with intricate, swirling patterns that seemed to shift when she looked at them too long. Before she could reach for the handle, the doors swung open on their own. A butler stood in the entryway, his posture perfectly straight, his suit impeccable. He nodded once. "Miss Carter, I presume? Mr. Sterling is expecting you. Please, follow me." His voice was calm, yet distant, as if he had long since stopped being surprised by anything in this house. Elena forced herself to nod and stepped inside. The air changed the moment she crossed the threshold. It smelled of polished wood and something faintly floral, like fresh-cut roses mixed with aged paper. The house was massive. Vaulted ceilings, towering bookshelves, and chandeliers so large they looked like they belonged in a palace. Yet despite the grandeur, there was something strangely empty about it. No music, no idle chatter from unseen staff, no warmth, just silence. Heavy and suffocating. She followed the butler down a long corridor, her footsteps muffled by an expensive Persian rug that stretched the length of the hallway. Paintings lined the walls, portraits of men in suits and women in elaborate gowns, their eyes following her as she walked. Most houses like this were museums of wealth, meant to display power. But this felt like something else entirely. The butler stopped at a pair of dark oak doors, knocking twice before pushing them open. "Mr. Sterling," he announced, "Miss Carter has arrived." Elena stepped inside, her heart hammering against her ribs. The study was bathed in golden light from the floor-to-ceiling windows, which overlooked the sprawling, meticulously kept garden. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes that smelled of age and wisdom. A massive mahogany desk sat near the window, and behind it was the man she was about to marry. Alexander Sterling. He was nothing like she had imagined. Elena had expected frailty, someone weak and sickly, a man who needed a legal wife simply to have someone sign off on his estate when he was gone. But the man sitting before her exuded an entirely different kind of presence. He was tall, his frame lean but solid, dressed in a dark suit tailored to perfection. His silver-white hair was neatly combed back, and even from across the room, she could see the sharpness in his ice-blue eyes. They assessed her in a way that made her feel exposed, like he was peeling back her layers, one by one, without even speaking. "Miss Carter," he said finally, his voice deep and smooth with a kind of practiced detachment. "Please, have a seat." Elena hesitated only for a moment, before stepping forward and lowering herself into the chair across from him. She folded her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. Alexander studied her for a long moment, and the silence stretched, filling the room with an almost unbearable weight. Then he leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. "I assume Derek explained the arrangement to you." She nodded. "He did. And yet, you came." It wasn't a question, not really. More of an observation, one that made something cold settle in her stomach. "I didn't have much of a choice," she admitted. His lips curved slightly. Not quite a smile, but something close. "We always have choices, Miss Carter. Some are just less appealing than others." She didn't know how to respond to that, so she stayed silent. Alexander reached into a drawer and pulled out a sleek black folder, sliding it across the desk toward her. "This contains the details of our arrangement," he said. "You will find that I am a man of my word. Your mother's medical bills will be covered, your siblings will be provided for, and when I die, you will inherit a portion of my estate." A portion. Not all of it. Something about that made her pause. "What's the catch?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Amusement, maybe. "There are rules," he said simply. "Conditions." She swallowed. "Like what?" Alexander leaned forward slightly, and for the first time she caught a hint of something beneath his carefully controlled exterior. Something heavier. "You will live here," he said. "You will not question my business or my past. You will not enter the east wing of the mansion, and under no circumstances are you to invite strangers into this house." The way he said it sent a shiver down her spine. "Why?" she asked, before she could stop herself. His jaw tightened. "Because I said so." The silence between them thickened, stretched until it felt like the air itself had weight. Finally, he exhaled, his expression smoothing back into cold neutrality. "If you agree to these terms, sign the contract." Elena stared at the folder in front of her. Everything about this felt wrong. Every instinct she had was screaming at her to run, to get up and leave before she was pulled into something she didn't understand. But then she thought of home, of her mother, of Michael and Lily. This wasn't about her. She picked up the pen. Her fingers trembled as she signed her name on the dotted line. When she set the pen down, Alexander nodded once, as if he had expected nothing less. "Welcome to your new life, Mrs. Sterling." Elena woke before dawn, the silence of the mansion pressing down on her like a weight. Even in the darkness, she could feel how vast the room was, how utterly foreign. The bed beneath her was too soft, the air too still. It felt wrong. Everything about this place felt wrong. She sat up slowly, her fingers brushing against the expensive sheets. Moonlight streamed in through the towering windows, casting ghostly patterns on the walls. For a moment, she let herself believe she was still in her tiny apartment, that she could roll over and hear Lily's soft breathing in the next room, the faint hum of the city outside. But when she turned, she was met with an unfamiliar sight. The elegant furnishings, the massive antique wardrobe, the gilded mirror reflecting back the image of a girl who no longer belonged to herself. She exhaled and pushed back the covers, her bare feet meeting the cold marble floor. The house was too quiet, too controlled. She had expected something else, something warmer, at least some sign of life beyond the polished floors and pristine hallways. But no, this wasn't a home. It was a monument to something long forgotten. Dressing quickly in the simple clothes left for her in the wardrobe, she made her way toward the door, hesitating before pulling it open. The hallway stretched before her, lined with portraits of people she didn't know, their painted eyes following her as she moved. The house was a labyrinth of wealth and history, each hallway leading to another carefully curated part of Alexander Sterling's world. The scent of fresh coffee and something buttery drifted from down the hall, guiding her toward the dining room. She followed it instinctively, her stomach twisting, not with hunger, but with unease. When she stepped inside, Alexander was already seated at the long dining table, dressed in yet another perfectly tailored suit. He looked up from his newspaper as she entered, his blue eyes assessing her in that quiet, unreadable way he always did. "Good morning," he said, setting the paper down. His voice was smooth, almost disinterested. Elena nodded, slipping into a chair a few seats away from him. The table was absurdly large for just 2 people, stretching on longer than necessary, its dark wood polished to perfection. The kind of table meant for grand gatherings, for laughter and conversation. But there was none of that here. Just silence and restraint. A butler appeared almost instantly, placing a plate in front of her. Scrambled eggs, toast, a side of fruit, more food than she had eaten in days. She hesitated for only a second before picking up her fork. "You didn't sleep," Alexander observed. Elena didn't look up. "This place is different." "That's one way to put it," he mused. She glanced at him then, trying to decipher what kind of man he was beneath all that quiet control. There was something about him, something unsettling. He wasn't cruel, but he wasn't kind either. He existed in a space between, neither welcoming nor threatening, a man made of contradiction. "You'll adjust," he said, as if reading her thoughts. She wasn't sure about that. For a while they ate in silence, the only sound the soft clink of silverware against porcelain. It wasn't until the butler had cleared their plates that Alexander finally spoke again. "There are a few things we need to discuss." Elena tensed, setting down her fork. "I figured." He folded his hands in front of him, his expression unreadable. "The staff have been informed of your presence, and they have been instructed to accommodate you. If you need anything, you may ask them. However, there are rules in this house." Elena held his gaze, waiting. "You already know the most important one," he continued. "The East Wing is off limits. You will not enter it under any circumstances." Her fingers curled against her lap. "Why?" His expression didn't change. "Because I said so." Something flickered beneath his composed exterior, something sharp and final. A warning. Elena didn't push. "Not yet. You may go anywhere else in the house, but you are expected to respect the space of those who work here. The staff are not here to befriend you." She nodded once, resisting the urge to roll her eyes. "Understood." Alexander leaned back in his chair, studying her for a long moment. "One more thing. Here it comes. You are free to come and go as you please," he said. "But under no circumstances are you to bring strangers into this house." She frowned. "You really think I'd invite people over like this as some kind of vacation?" He didn't smile, but something in his eyes shifted, as if he found her response vaguely amusing. "I don't take unnecessary risks, Miss Carter." It wasn't the answer she expected, and it only left her with more questions. The conversation ended there, and Alexander rose from his seat, leaving her alone at the table. Elena sat there for a long moment, staring at the untouched coffee in front of her, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in her gut. What the hell had she just signed up for? The rest of the day passed in a strange blur. She wandered the house, letting herself take in the endless hallways, the grand staircase, the impossibly high ceilings. It was beautiful, in a cold, detached sort of way. Too perfect, too still. The few staff members she encountered spoke in hushed tones, offering polite nods before hurrying about their work. No one lingered. No one asked questions. By the time evening fell, she had explored most of the house, except for the East Wing. She found herself standing at the entrance to it, her heart hammering in her chest. The double doors were massive, dark oak with intricate carvings that seemed to twist and shift under the dim lighting. She reached for the handle, testing it. Locked, of course. A shiver ran down her spine, and she quickly turned away. Dinner was another quiet affair, though Alexander seemed slightly less distant than before. He asked her about her studies, about her plans before all of this. She answered cautiously, not sure if he truly cared or if he was simply assessing her, learning what kind of person she was. Later that night, as she lay in bed, staring up at the ornate ceiling, she heard it. A sound, distant but distinct. A soft, muffled noise coming from the east wing. She sat up, her heart pounding. For a long time, she stayed frozen, listening. Then, just as quickly as it had started, it was gone. The house returned to its unnatural silence. Alina lay back down, pulling the covers up to her chin. She told herself she imagined it. But deep down, she knew she hadn't, and that terrified her more than anything. The sound came again, the next night. Alina had been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, sleep refusing to take her. The mansion was suffocating in its silence, but now something was moving. It was faint, just barely audible over the distant wind outside. But it was there, a slow, deliberate creak. She sat up, heart hammering, straining to hear. There it was again. A muffled sound, something shifting in the walls. No, not in the walls. From the other side of the house, the east wing. She pushed back the covers, her breath uneven. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to ignore it, to lie back down, to pretend she heard nothing. But that wasn't who she was. Cautiously, she slid out of bed, her bare feet meeting the cold marble floor. The hallway outside was dark, the dim glow of antique sconces flickering along the walls. The portraits lining the corridor seemed to watch her, their painted eyes gleaming in the faint light. She moved slowly, her pulse loud in her ears. The house was still, the kind of stillness that didn't feel natural, like it was holding its breath. She reached the grand staircase and descended carefully, her fingers trailing along the ornate railing. The main floor stretched before her, filled with endless archways and shadowed hallways. But she had only one destination, the east wing. Her heart pounded as she neared the heavy oak doors that marked the forbidden section of the house. They loomed before her, towering and unyielding, their carved patterns twisting in the dim light. She hesitated. She could turn back. But then, hey! Another sound. This time, it was clear. A whisper. Not the wind, not the house settling. A voice. And it was coming from the other side of the doors. Elena swallowed hard, her fingers trembling as she reached for the handle. She didn't know what she was expecting. Of course, it was locked. Of course, Alexander had made sure of that. She exhaled shakily and took a step back. Then, another creak. She froze. Not from the door, from behind her. A chill ran down her spine as she turned, slowly, heart hammering against her ribs. Alexander stood at the far end of the hallway, his presence a shadow against the dim light. He wasn't dressed in his usual suit. This time he wore something looser, more casual, as if she had caught him in a rare, unguarded moment. But his expression, it was unreadable. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, voice deceptively calm. Elena forced herself to breathe. "I heard something." Alexander didn't blink. "Did you?" The way he said it sent a shiver through her. She glanced at the doors behind her. "What's in there?" A muscle in his jaw twitched. "I told you that part of the house is off limits." She folded her arms, trying to steady her voice. "Why?" "Because I said so." His tone was final, cold, but beneath it, something else lurked, a flicker of something unspoken. He wasn't angry. He was wary, like he was expecting her to ask, like he knew she would. Elena swallowed. "Are you keeping something in there?" His lips twitched, just the barest hint of amusement. "Wouldn't you like to know?" Her stomach twisted. This was a game to him, but she wasn't playing. "If I'm supposed to live here, I have a right to know what's in my own house." Alexander took a slow step forward, his presence somehow overwhelming despite his measured movements. "You signed a contract, Miss Carter." His voice was softer now, more dangerous. "You agreed to the terms." A warning, a reminder. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Finally, he tilted his head slightly, studying her with something between curiosity and calculation. "Go back to bed, Elena." It was the first time he had said her name. She didn't know why that sent ice down her spine. But she listened. She turned, walking away, feeling his gaze follow her long after she was gone. Elena didn't return to bed. She sat awake for hours, staring at the moonlight filtering through her window, her mind racing. What was in the East Wing? She had seen the shift in Alexander's expression. He wasn't just hiding something, he was guarding it. The next morning at breakfast, things felt normal, or at least as normal as they could be in a house like this. The butler served her coffee, the sunlight streamed in through the massive dining room windows, and Alexander sat at the far end of the table, reading the paper as if nothing had happened. She wanted to ask again, but she didn't. Not yet. Instead, she spent the next few days watching, observing. She noticed how the staff never went near the East Wing, how the butler, who always moved with calm precision, stiffened slightly whenever she walked too close to the forbidden doors. She noticed how Alexander never lingered in that part of the house either. And yet, she heard things at night, soft murmurs, shuffling footsteps, and sometimes something heavier, like the sound of metal against metal. A door unlocking. One evening, as she wandered the halls, she found herself outside the library. It was a massive room, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, warm leather chairs, a fireplace that cast golden light across the dark wood floors. And Alexander was there. He sat in one of the chairs near the fire, a book in his hands, but his attention wasn't on it. He was watching the flames, his expression distant. She hesitated before stepping inside. "Do you ever sleep?" she asked lightly. He glanced up, lips curving slightly. "Do you?" Elena folded her arms. "Not lately." He didn't seem surprised. She hesitated before speaking again. "Alexander, what are you hiding?" This time, he did smile. But it wasn't reassuring. "Many things," he said. "Tell me one." He leaned back slightly, studying her. "Curiosity is dangerous, Miss Carter." "So, I've been told." He exhaled, setting the book down. "Do you really want to know?" Her pulse quickened. "Yes." For a moment, he didn't speak. Then, slowly, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. Elena tensed. But he didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a key, a small, ornate key, and set it on the table between them. She stared at it, then at him. "Go ahead," he murmured. "Open the door." Her breath hitched. Was this a test? A game? She hesitated, fingers trembling as she reached for it. As soon as she touched the metal, something in his expression changed. Something dark, something final. "You can't take it back once you know," he said softly. A warning, a challenge. Elena curled her fingers around the key and made her choice. Elena's fingers tightened around the key, the cool metal pressing against her palm. She had expected Alexander to stop her, to smirk and snatch it back at the last moment, to remind her that she had signed away the right to ask questions. But he didn't. He only watched as she stood, as she backed away from the library, the key still clenched in her grip, watched as she turned and walked toward the east wing. Her heart pounded with each step. The hallway stretched before her, dimly lit, the sconces casting flickering shadows against the walls. The portraits here were different, darker, heavier. The eyes of painted figures seemed to follow her, their expressions unreadable. She reached the locked doors. Pausing, she glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see Alexander standing there, watching. But he wasn't. She was alone. Slowly, she lifted the key, fitting it into the lock. Her fingers trembled as she turned it. A soft click. The door creaked open. The air beyond was colder, untouched by the warmth of the rest of the mansion. The scent of dust, aged paper, and something faintly metallic drifted toward her. She hesitated. This was a mistake. She knew it was a mistake. But she stepped inside anyway. The hallway beyond was lined with doors, each identical, stretching into the distance. A single window at the far end allowed a sliver of moonlight to spill onto the dark wood floors, illuminating dust floating in the still air. Elena swallowed. What was this place? A storage area? A forgotten wing of the house? She took a cautious step forward, then another. Her footsteps were deafening in the silence. One of the doors stood slightly ajar. A breath hitched in her throat as she approached it. Something shifted inside. A faint rustling. She stopped, pulse hammering. She should turn around. She should leave. But her hand was already reaching out. She pushed the door open. The room beyond was dimly lit by a single lamp, casting a pool of yellow light onto a wooden desk cluttered with papers, books stacked in uneven piles. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, their drawers slightly open, documents spilling out as if someone had been searching for something in a hurry. But what made Elena's stomach drop, what made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end, was the large board mounted on the far wall. Pinned to it were photographs, newspapers, and at the center of it all, her own face. Elena staggered back, her breath catching in her throat. There were photos of her walking to work, of her sitting on the bus, of her picking up groceries with Michael and Lily. Dozens of them. Some taken from a distance. Some close enough to see the worry in her eyes. Her hands trembled as she reached out, touching one of the papers pinned next to her photo. It was a file, a full dossier. Carter, Elena. Age, 22. Occupation, medical student/waitress. Known relatives. Joanne Carter, mother. Michael Carter, brother. Lily Carter, sister. Financial status, destitute. She flipped to another page. Subject has been under observation for 6 months. Recruitment potential high. Risk level Recruitment? Her stomach twisted violently. Before she could process what she was reading, movement flickered in her peripheral vision. She turned sharply. A figure stood in the doorway. Alexander. His face was unreadable, cast in shadow, but his presence filled the room like a storm waiting to break. "You knew?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. He stepped inside, his movements slow, deliberate. "I always know." Her fingers curled around the paper in her hand, crumpling it. You were watching me. Yeah. A cold wave of realization crashed over her. This wasn't just an arrangement, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You chose me. Something flickered in his eyes. Something unreadable. I did. Elena's breath was shallow, her chest tight. Why? Alexander didn't answer right away. Instead, he moved to the board, fingers tracing the edge of one of the photographs. I needed someone. His voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it. Someone smart, someone desperate enough to take this deal, someone who wouldn't ask too many questions. Her nails dug into her palms. And what? You just picked me? Like I was some kind of experiment? He exhaled slowly. I picked you because you were capable, because you had potential. Elena felt sick. I don't understand, she whispered. Potential for what? Alexander turned then, truly looking at her. And for the first time since she had met him, she saw it. Not just wealth, not just power. Something deeper, something calculated. You weren't brought here to be my wife, Elena. The air left her lungs. His voice was calm, measured. You were brought here to replace me. She stared at him, heart pounding so hard it hurt. What? Alexander stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. This house, this name, this power. It's not just mine. It's an inheritance, a role, and my time is running out. She shook her head, unable to comprehend what she was hearing. That doesn't make any sense. You're dying, he finished for her. Yeah, the words felt like a slap. I knew that, her voice wavered. I knew you were sick. You knew what I led, you know. Her hands trembled. What are you? A long silence stretched between them. Then, a survivor. The word was simple, but it carried a weight she didn't understand. She wanted to scream. She wanted to demand answers, to make sense of the madness unraveling in front of her. But she couldn't, because beneath the fear, beneath the betrayal, beneath everything, she realized something else. She had already been pulled too deep, and she wasn't sure she wanted to claw her way out. Elena didn't move. She couldn't. Her pulse hammered in her ears, drowning out the quiet crackle of the lamp in the corner. The walls felt like they were closing in, the air pressing against her lungs as she tried to process what Alexander had just said. You were brought here to replace me. The words didn't make sense. They couldn't. This had started as a transaction, one she had barely agreed to, a marriage of convenience, a contract written in cold ink and colder expectations. And yet, standing here, staring at the dossier detailing her life in chilling detail, she realized it had never been just that. She had been chosen, not as a wife, as something else, something far more dangerous. Elena finally forced herself to speak, though her voice was barely above a whisper. What do you mean, replace you? Alexander didn't look away. He didn't shift or hesitate. He simply watched her, the way a man watches a chessboard before making a final move. You've spent the past few weeks wondering why I'm like this, he said evenly. Why I keep this house the way it is. Why I live alone. Why I avoid people. You hear things at night. You've felt it, haven't you? A cold chill wrapped around her spine. She had felt it. The unnatural stillness of the mansion. The way the staff walked on eggshells around him. The whispers she wasn't meant to hear. The shadow she swore shifted just beyond the reach of candlelight. And then there was him. The way he moved, too. Precisely. The way he never showed fear, not even when he should have. The way his eyes never truly reflected his age. "Who are you?" she asked, voice shaking. Alexander exhaled slowly. "A man with enemies," he said. "More than I can count. And I don't mean business rivals, Elena. I mean people who would burn this house to the ground just to make sure I never take another breath." Elena's stomach twisted. "So, you brought me here to what? Be a decoy? Let them kill me in your place?" Something flashed in his eyes, a warning. "No." His voice was sharp, final. "I brought you here to succeed me." The room seemed to tilt. Elena let out a sharp, breathless laugh. "You're insane." "Am I?" His calm, collected tone only made it worse. She shook her head violently. "I don't want this. I don't even know what this is." "You will." A crack of thunder rumbled outside, shaking the windows. A storm had rolled in, unnoticed, thick rain slamming against the glass. The wind howled through the trees beyond the estate, as if the world itself could sense the shift happening in that room. Elena took a step back. "Let me leave." Alexander didn't move. "That's not what you want." "You don't get to decide that," she snapped, her voice rising, hands trembling at her sides. "I came here for a deal, a contract, not this." She gestured wildly at the board, the files, the madness he had trapped her in. "You came here because you had no choice," he corrected. "But now you do." Her jaw clenched. "I don't want to be you." His expression didn't change. "Then be something better." A flash of lightning illuminated the room, casting his face in stark contrast. The high cheekbones, the sharp angles, the unshakable certainty in his gaze. And for the first time since she met him, she saw something else. He wasn't just offering her power. He was desperate. Because he knew something she didn't. Because whatever was coming for him, it was coming for her too. The storm raged outside, the house groaning against the wind. Then, a sound. Not thunder, not rain. A gunshot. It came from downstairs. Elena's body reacted before her mind could catch up. She moved, spinning toward the door, but Alexander was already in front of her, grabbing her wrist. "Stay here," he ordered. She wrenched her arm away. "Like hell." Another shot rang out, this time closer. Voices, shouting. Alexander's jaw tightened. Then, with a speed she didn't know he possessed, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a gun, checking the chamber with practiced efficiency. Her breath hitched. He wasn't scared. He was prepared. "How many?" she asked, pulse racing. Alexander flicked the safety off. "Doesn't matter." It did matter. But she didn't have time to argue. Another sound, a crash, and then a scream. One of the staff. Elena's stomach turned to ice. Without thinking, she bolted past Alexander, sprinting into the hallway. He cursed behind her, but she didn't stop. She couldn't, because whoever was in this house, they weren't here for money. They were here for blood. Elena took the stairs two at a time, nearly slipping on the polished floors as she reached the lower level. The main foyer was in chaos. The grand chandelier swayed dangerously, casting jagged shadows along the marble floor. One of the guards was down, blood pooling beneath him. And standing over his body, a man in dark tactical gear, a silenced pistol still raised. Elena barely had time to react before the intruder turned. His eyes locked onto hers. Then, he fired. She dove, hitting the ground hard as the bullet shattered the mirror behind her. "Elena!" Alexander's voice was sharp, furious. A second shot rang out, but this time it wasn't aimed at her. Alexander moved fast. Faster than he should have. One moment he was on the stairs. The next he was beside her, gun raised, his shot hitting the intruder's shoulder with pinpoint precision. The man stumbled back, cursing, before disappearing into the shadows of the hallway. Then, more of them. They emerged from the dark, weapons drawn, their movements coordinated. This wasn't a robbery. This wasn't random. They had planned this. "Elena." Alexander grabbed her arm, yanking her to her feet. "We need to go. Now." She didn't argue. Not this time. They ran. Through the house, down unfamiliar corridors, the sound of gunfire echoing behind them. Everything blurred, rushing past doors, turning corners too fast, the burn of adrenaline in her veins. Then, a door. Heavy. Steel. Reinforced. Alexander shoved it open, pulling her inside before slamming it shut. The room was small, filled with monitors, security feeds flashing across the screens. A panic room. Her breath came fast, ragged. Who are they? Alexander pressed a hand against the console, locking the door behind them. "The people I told you about." She shook her head. "No." "Who are you to them?" He met her gaze. And this time, he didn't lie. The last mistake they ever made. Outside, the gunfire didn't stop. But inside, everything had already changed. The air in the panic room was tight with tension, the walls pressing in around them. The security monitors flickered, displaying distorted images of the mansion's halls, where shadows moved like ghosts through the corridors. Gunfire rang out in the distance, muffled by layers of reinforced steel, but Elena could still feel it, the weight of it, the danger. She turned to Alexander, pulse hammering. "How long until they get in?" His expression remained calm, but there was something beneath the surface now. A calculation running behind those piercing blue eyes. He glanced at the monitors, fingers moving swiftly across the control panel. "They won't," he said. She let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Then he added, "Not alive, anyway." A shiver ran down her spine. Alexander pressed another button, and a soft vibration rumbled through the floor beneath them. The security feed flickered, shifting to a different set of cameras. Ones Elena hadn't seen before. Always. Secret passageways. Hidden vantage points throughout the house. And in them, more men. Not intruders. Alexander's men. Elena inhaled sharply. "You had security this whole time?" "Of course." He didn't even glance at her. "Did you really think I'd let just anyone waltz in here and kill me?" Her jaw clenched. "Then why didn't they stop them before they got inside?" Alexander finally turned, expression unreadable. "Because I let them." The words landed like a slap. She shook her head. "You what?" He gestured toward the screen, where the invaders were now being picked off, one, by unseen marksmen. "They thought they were hunting me." His voice was calm, almost amused, "but I was hunting them." Elena stared at the screen, at the men who were slowly being eliminated as they moved deeper into the house. Some never saw it coming. Others did. But not in time. You used yourself as bait, she realized, voice barely above a whisper. He inclined his head slightly. It worked. Something about his casual tone made nausea churn in her stomach. These are people, she snapped. They're dying. Alexander raised an eyebrow. So was I. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Because he was right. They were here to kill him. And her, by extension. Because of whatever twisted game he had been playing long before she ever stepped foot into this house. Her fingers curled into fists. Who sent them? Alexander exhaled, running a hand through his silver-white hair. For the first time since the attack began, something flickered in his expression. Something heavier. Does it matter? Yes. He studied her for a long moment. Then, finally, he said, "The same people who made me." Elena stiffened. "What does that mean?" Alexander leaned against the control panel, the soft glow of the screens casting sharp shadows across his face. "I wasn't born into wealth," he said. "Not like people assume. I built this empire, and before that, I was something else." She swallowed. Something else? His lips quirked, but it wasn't a smile. A weapon. The panic room suddenly felt smaller. Tighter. She had known, suspected at least, that Alexander was more than just some reclusive billionaire with a shadowy past. But hearing him say it out loud was different. It made everything real. "What did you do?" she asked, voice cautious. His gaze darkened. "Whatever they told me to." Elena's stomach twisted. "And now they want you dead." "Yes." She exhaled shakily. "Why?" Alexander didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned back to the monitors, watching as the last of the intruders fell, their bodies motionless on the marble floors of the mansion. Then, quietly, he said, "Because I left." The weight in his voice made her chest tighten. "You left," she echoed. "So they sent people to kill you?" He let out a soft, humorless laugh. "No one leaves, Elena." His gaze flicked to her. "Not really." The words sent ice through her veins, because she understood what he was saying. Whoever they were, the people Alexander had worked for, they owned him. Or at least, they thought they did. And now they wanted him erased. Her hands trembled at her sides. "And me?" For the first time, something in his expression softened. "You weren't supposed to be a part of this," he admitted. "Not like this." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "Well, too late." Outside, the gunfire had stopped. The house had gone still again. Alexander straightened. "It's over." She shook her head. "No, it's not." He arched an eyebrow. "This won't stop," she said, pulse racing. "If they sent people once, they'll do it again." A beat of silence. Then, softly, Alexander said, "That's why I chose you." Elena inhaled sharply. The words echoed in her head, weaving into everything else she had learned tonight. The dossier, the contract, the replacement. Her throat went dry. "You want me to become you." A long pause. Then, "I want you to survive." Her chest tightened. "You think they'll kill you, don't you?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Elena took a shaky step back, heart pounding. "You never expected to make it out of this, did you?" His jaw clenched, and suddenly she understood. This wasn't just about training her, about making her capable. This was about ensuring someone carried on what he had built, because Alexander Sterling had already accepted his fate. He had been planning for this from the moment she arrived. A slow, searing anger burned in her chest. "You manipulated me." Her voice was quieter now, deadlier. Alexander exhaled, as if he had been expecting this reaction. "I prepared you?" She laughed, sharp, bitter. "For what?" He didn't blink. "For war." The finality in his tone sent another shiver through her. The house was still. The blood had barely dried on the floors. But Alina knew, in that moment, this was just the beginning. Elena sat in the grand study, staring at the glass of whiskey Alexander had placed in front of her. The amber liquid caught the dim light, swirling as she turned it in her hands. But she didn't take a sip. She wasn't even sure why he had given it to her. Maybe as a peace offering. Maybe because he thought she needed it, after everything that had just happened. She wasn't sure he was wrong. The mansion was silent again, but not the way it had been before. Not the eerie, unnatural quiet she had grown accustomed to. This was something else. The kind of silence that comes after violence. The kind that lingers in the air like gunpowder, waiting to settle in the cracks of a house that would never be the same again. Across from her, Alexander leaned back in his chair, the weight of the night pressing into the deep lines on his face. He looked tired, not just physically, but in a way that went deeper than that. "You should rest," he said, voice low. "You've been through a lot." Elena let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "And you haven't?" Alexander smirked slightly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I've had practice." She studied him, searching for something beneath the calm exterior. Some hint of fear, of uncertainty, but there was none. Because he had always known this was coming. "You set me up," she said quietly. His gaze didn't waver. "I prepared you." Her fingers curled around the glass. "Don't pretend that's the same thing." Alexander exhaled, rubbing a hand across his jaw. "You think I wanted it to happen this way?" She set the whiskey down with a sharp clink. "I don't know, Alexander." "Did you?" His expression remained unreadable. "You were never supposed to be caught in this." "But I was," she snapped. "And now what? You think I'm just going to take your place? Slide into whatever life you built and pretend like this is normal?" He tilted his head slightly. "You could walk away." Her breath caught. He wasn't lying. She could feel that he wasn't lying. For the first time since she stepped into this house, the choice was truly hers. She could take the money, disappear, go back to Michael, to Lily, to the life she had fought so hard to hold on to. But it wasn't the same anymore. She wasn't the same. And Alexander knew that. He had known it from the moment she signed that contract. Her hands trembled as she pushed herself up from the chair, pacing toward the tall windows that overlooked the estate grounds. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky washed clean, stars still flickering beyond the heavy clouds. Everything looked untouched, but it wasn't, because tonight had changed everything. "You should leave," Alexander said behind her. Elena turned slowly. "You want me to go?" Something flickered in his expression. "I want you to be sure." She crossed her arms. "And if I stay?" Alexander studied her for a long moment. Then he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Then you become something else. Something they won't see coming." Her pulse quickened. She had spent her whole life on the outside. The girl who struggled to keep up, who barely had enough to survive, the one who had to fight for every single scrap of control. And now here he was, offering her something else. Not just survival. Power. It was terrifying and intoxicating. She inhaled sharply, running a hand through her hair. "You said you were a weapon once." A pause. Then, "Yes." She met his gaze. "What if I don't want to be one?" His lips twitched. "Then you learn how to wield one instead." A chill ran down her spine. Not because of what he was offering, but because she wasn't sure she wanted to refuse it. The mansion would never feel like home, but she had a feeling home wasn't a place for people like Alexander Sterling. And maybe not for people like her either. Finally, she exhaled. "Teach me." Alexander's gaze didn't waver. Then, slowly, he nodded. And just like that, her old life was gone. She had made her choice, and there was no turning back. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. Your presence here means more than you know. At its core, the contract of shadows isn't just about power, deception, or survival. It's about transformation. Life doesn't always present us with choices wrapped in fairness. Sometimes we are forced into impossible decisions, ones that test not just our strength, but our very identity. Elena's journey teaches us that control isn't always given, it's taken. That the world doesn't wait for us to be ready, and that sometimes the hardest battles are the ones fought within ourselves. What about you? Where are you watching from? I'd love to know. If this story gripped you, if it made you think, if you want more stories that challenge the way we see the world, subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. Because trust me, the best is yet to come. Until next time, stay sharp, stay curious, and never underestimate the power of choice.